having trouble connecting, you can go ahead and use the link that is here on the screen. And I can also share links with you throughout the webinar, so I'll do that right now just to show you all. So go ahead and look for those links when I share them throughout the webinar. And once again, slides, handout, and recording will be distributed in the next few days. So for a quick overview of Sierra Camp, or the Sierra Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Partnership, we're a membership-based organization of nonprofits, businesses, and local governments working on behalf of a unified vision for climate action in the Sierra. The individuals and organizations in our partnership understand that their well-being depends on the health and long-term resilience of the natural systems around them. And our work is based on the belief that social, economic, and environmental systems are interconnected and inseparable, and that in collaboration between diverse sectors and communities is essential for our growth and prosperity, especially now in an era of warming temperatures and changing climate. So we work on climate adaptation and mitigation strategies through three key areas programmatically: climate change policy engagement and education, building relationships with urban areas to bridge the urban-rural divide, and supporting on-the-ground model projects. So one of our key partners is the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, better known as ARCA. We are one of the many other collaboratives from all over the state, and we work with them to share priorities and best practices, identify projects we can partner on, engage with policy as a coalition, and strengthen the urban-rural connection. ARCA is incredibly important for advancing climate adaptation and resilience throughout the state. This is a snapshot of our 31 members. You'll actually hear from 4 of them today. If anyone is interested in the membership process, check out our website and give me a call or email. And you'll see my contact information at the end of the webinar. So before we get into our presenters, I want to highlight a few key opportunities that have emerged. The first is next week we have Sierra Nevada Conservancy's annual Watershed Improvement Program Summit, which will be tackling the question of how we implement California's climate goals at a regional scale. And this will be in Sacramento and also will be webcast for folks that did not register in time. So I encourage you to tune in, ask questions, and give feedback on this huge regional initiative. Secondly, the National Forest Foundation is hosting a peer learning session on forest landscape and restoration in water. That will be next Thursday online. Thirdly, the Forest Resilience Bond is a great tool I want to highlight for you all, created by Blue Forest Conservation and its partners to leverage private capital to finance forest restoration projects in the Western United States. And this model is different because it uses both investor capital and cost sharing among beneficiaries to redefine how society addresses critical environmental challenges. I believe this model is being investigated as an option or even in use by Yuba County Water Agency, so a local partner there. I look forward to watching their project progress. Next, I also would encourage you all to check out the resources on the Sierra Camp website and the ARCA website, especially if you're new to the work in this area. We have a lot of grant opportunities, past webinars posted, policy reports, scientific data and data hubs, and other resources posted on our website and the ARCA website, as well as decision-making tools on the ARCA website. And we think these are all really great tools for climate action in the Sierra. And the last resource I have highlighted here is Civic Spark, which is a great AmeriCorps program that pairs college graduates with partners throughout the state to build capacity in local government. In fact, Sierra Camp is super lucky to have the support of one such fellow, Clark Stevenson, who is critical in making this great webinar happen. So to apply for a fellow and learn more about the program, follow the link on the screen, and the first priority deadline for applications is March 16th. So just so you all have those links easily available, I'm going to chat them over to you. Here you are. Okay, so next I have just a few policy and funding updates. If you have a climate change related research need, I encourage you to check out the Strategic Growth Council's Climate Change Research Program to see if your need corresponds with their research priorities. If it does, you might be able to apply for funding. Local agencies and nonprofits will be eligible to apply. The program uses about $11 million from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to support research on reducing carbon emissions, including clean energy, adaptation, and resiliency. And they will release a grant solicitation and a series of workshops for applicants this spring. So look out for that. Additionally, the Air Resources Board of the state recently released their draft funding guidelines for California's climate investments. These guidelines essentially determine how cap and trade revenues will be spent throughout their various programs of the state. And the Wildlife Conservation Board also just released their draft grant guidelines for their climate adaptation and resiliency program. So I encourage everyone to check these out, as both of them influence the distribution of state funding programs. Both agencies are accepting public comments, and the Wildlife Conservation Board comments are due around March 9th. We anticipate the CARB comment period will be closing sometime in the spring. So once again, here are those links. And finally, before we get into our speakers, two huge opportunities are some parks and water bond measures coming up on the June and November election ballots. And together, these each designate about $492 million in direct funding solely to the Sierra Nevada and Cascade for parks, water, drought, climate change, forest restoration, wildfire, outdoor recreation and access, and so much more. So Sierra Business Council is leading a campaign to spread the word about this unprecedented funding opportunity. And there are a number of different ways that you can engage with this campaign that range from simply getting out the word for these measures to formally endorsing each of them, or even donating if you have resources. All of these will be extremely important for getting the word out and getting these measures passed by voters. I did send out a handout yesterday to registrants with more information on how to get involved. This will again be distributed with the slides and the recording later in the week. And here's the link to the websites for each of these bond measures. So the basis of this webinar is the understanding that the communities and ecosystems of the Sierra Nevada cannot be resilient without healthy forests and watersheds. These systems are crucial for protecting the area as a whole from the impacts of climate change and helping the state achieve its carbon reduction goals. So the mechanisms of forest restoration, as I'm sure many of you are aware, can help us prevent destructive wildfire and flooding, increase our drought resilience and downstream water supply, protect and enhance our outdoor recreation economy and way of life, and invest in jobs and capital in our communities. So we hope that these 4 case studies will demonstrate this and exemplify the importance and impact of forest restoration and the biomass industry in the Sierra. Our speakers will cover model projects, best practices, challenges and lessons learned, and address key questions in the forest restoration dialogue. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, which is Sarah DiVittorio. Again, speaker bios are in the handout that was distributed before this webinar, and it will be distributed after the webinar as well. Sarah is the Northern California Program Manager for the National Forest Foundation, and she is here to speak about the Lake Tahoe West Partnership. So Sarah, I'm going to unmute you if you want to go ahead and share your screen. Sarah, if you can speak, then we can hear you, and we do see your screen now.
Great. So thank you for that introduction, Nikki. And I just want to start by saying thank you to Nikki and to the Sierra Business Council for giving me the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Lake Tahoe West project today. As Nikki said, I'm the Northern California Program Manager for the National Forest Foundation. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with our organization, we are the congressionally designated nonprofit partner of the U.S. Forest Service. Our mission is to bring together people to restore and enhance our national forests and grasslands. So part of what we do is encourage and support collaborative processes. And these are processes through which various stakeholders and agencies who often have different perspectives and different missions can come together to find shared solutions to challenging forest management problems. So in that vein, I serve as the project manager and facilitator for the Lake Tahoe West Restoration Partnership, which we call Lake Tahoe West for short. Today, I want to provide an overview of the Lake Tahoe West project and tell you a bit about how we're approaching sort of landscape resilience or regional resilience, as well as climate change. So before I launch in, I want to note that I joined this project just last September. So some of the work I'll be talking about, in fact, a lot of the work I'll be talking about was done before I got here. The initial convening of this effort and the work that was done before I came on board in terms of facilitation and project management was done by my predecessor, Dorian Fougere. I'm sure that some of you probably know Dorian, so I want to be sure to acknowledge that his sort of vision and leadership for this project were super instrumental in getting it where it is today. So the Lake Tahoe West is a collaborative effort to restore the resilience of the forests, watersheds, communities, and recreational opportunities of the west shore of Lake Tahoe, so that the landscape is more resilient and can better withstand threats, including wildfire, climate change, drought, and insects and disease. And those disturbances are, of course, all related and all likely to be exacerbated by climate change. So climate change is very much, at the center of the concerns that we're trying to address in our project. The map that I'm showing right now is it shows the Lake Tahoe West project boundary. So the bold black line shows our planning area, which extends from the shore of Lake Tahoe up to that ridgeline. So it's basically the entire west shore of the Lake Tahoe Basin. That's our primary focus area within which we are doing most of our analysis and planning, and we'll be implementing projects. We've also done some landscape scale analysis across a larger area. So that's what that dotted line is that extends a little bit farther west and onto the west slope. But our main focus area is within that, the planning area. So Lake Tahoe West is led by 4 public agencies. This is very much a multi-jurisdictional landscape, and so it's really important to have this interagency collaboration. Those 4 public agencies are the California Tahoe Conservancy, the U.S. Forest Service Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, California State Parks, and the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, or TRPA. The National Forest Foundation and the Tahoe Fire and Fuel Team are also 2 additional key sort of conveners. And beyond that group, we have significant involvement by a diverse group of stakeholders representing conservation, recreation, homeowner, business, and other perspectives, as well as the involvement of some other important agencies like the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board, and Placer and El Dorado counties are also engaged to some degree. Lake Tahoe West is a landscape scale effort, and so all stages of the project are basically proceeding with a fundamental orientation that we're working to achieve resilience at a landscape scale. So all of our analysis and strategy and planning work is really occurring with this landscape scale orientation in mind. And the basic assumption is that we can achieve better outcomes by focusing on the landscape scale rather than continuing what has been kind of a piecemeal approach in the Lake Tahoe Basin. The Lake Tahoe West project is also very much underpinned by a science-based approach. So I'll say more about that in a few minutes. First, let me walk you through kind of the phases of our project. We just finished up phase 1 last December and launched into phase 2. That's where we currently are. Phase 1 was a landscape resilience assessment where we basically identified what a resilient landscape would look like, what we think a resilient landscape would look like in the future, and then did an assessment to compare the current state of the landscape to that sort of ideal resilient state. And that assessment helped us identify kind of the areas that are the most out of whack on our landscape. I'll say more about the landscape resilience assessment in a minute. The phase 2, where we are now, our end goal in phase 2 is development of a high-level landscape restoration strategy. So through this phase, we are asking, what are the most effective ways to accomplish restoration across the landscape? What are the strategies that are going to be best to get us to forest resilience, or landscape resilience, I should say. And as I said, the end goal is to develop kind of a high-level strategic document that looks at the effectiveness of different management strategies as well as risks and trade-offs. The idea is that that landscape restoration strategy will be sort of the guiding document for project planning, which will get more specific in terms of on-the-ground projects. That will happen in phase 3. Then phase 4 is further out. That's our permitting phase, and phase 5 is implementation, monitoring, and performance measurement. So we're hoping to have our landscape restoration strategy completed by about October of this year, and then we'll launch into project planning. We don't expect to be implementing projects on the ground until probably at least 2020. I want to spend a little more time telling you about both phase 1 and phase 2, the landscape resilience assessment and the landscape restoration strategy that we're developing and how we're developing that. I want to first acknowledge that we have an absolutely crack team of agency managers and experts involved in this project, and they did an amazing job with the landscape resilience assessment. It's really a super impressive product. We have ecologists, foresters, hydrologists, wildlife biologists, who all put their heads together towards developing this assessment, which was also developed through pretty close engagement with stakeholders through every step of the way. So the landscape resilience assessment began by identifying the range of things on the landscape that we care about, which we call landscape values and services. So those values and services encompass upland ecosystems, meadow and riparian ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, public health and safety, cultural landscapes, and recreation. Our team then developed indicators of resilience to disturbance for those landscape values. And then we mapped those indicators across the landscape to identify areas that were more or less resilient. And I'll show you a couple of examples of those maps in a moment. Before I show some results of the landscape resilience assessment, let me give a little history and context about forests in the basin. So, you know, some of the key challenges that we face in Lake Tahoe are similar to what forests and communities across the Sierra face. The forests of the entire Lake Tahoe Basin were basically clear-cut between 1860 and 1890, and the wood was used mainly to feed silver mining operations in Nevada. I guess the mine tunnels there were very unstable and they required a lot of timber to shore them up so they wouldn't collapse. And so a lot of our timber in Lake Tahoe was sent down to Nevada for that purpose. So since that time, forests have grown back, but they've done so in ways that very much reflect that history. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds on our methods, but I want to give you some examples of what we found about the current state of the landscape through our assessment. Like the rest of the Sierra, forests here are overly dense for the most part. and they're often fairly uniform in terms of cereal stage. So for example, we have a lot of sort of mid-cereal stage and very little old growth on our landscape. And that just reflects, you know, a forest kind of all growing back at the same time after having been clear cut. So this slide that I'm projecting right now shows results for a couple of the individual indicators that we analyzed and mapped as part of our landscape resilience assessment. So the image on the left shows that we have a lot of mid-cereal stage forest on the landscape and very little old growth. The image on the right shows that we tend to have pretty dense forests measured as trees per acre across the landscape. And so we did this kind of analysis for, I think we ended up with 19 indicators. Don't quote me on that. And we mapped each one of them basically using this spatial visualization. So that was really helpful in getting a handle on what our landscape looks like in terms of, you know, relative to what would be a resilient state. We, several of our indicators address meadows, riparian systems, and watersheds. And so this is an example of one of those. Those systems are out of whack in a number of ways, as we found through our assessment, not surprisingly. For example, our streams have many barriers to fish passage. So that's one of the indicators that we assess, and you can see the results on this map, where the red areas show barriers to fish passage in many of our west shore streams. We also combined multiple indicators into composites to ask how resilient we are to disturbances across sort of multiple landscape values and services. And when we did that, we could start to see a really interesting pattern where low elevations and canyons on our landscape tend to be areas of least resilience. The uplands tend to be in a little bit better shape. So on the left, you can see what we found in terms of resilience to fire across our landscape. In the middle, resilience to climate change, and on the right, resilience to drought. And they all kind of follow that same pattern. We finalized the landscape resilience assessment in December, and I'm more than happy to share that with anyone. If you want to email me, I can point you to it. You could also probably just Google Lake Tahoe West partnership, and our website should come up, and it's up towards the top of that website. But I'm happy to email it to you if you want to get in touch. I want to spend the last couple minutes talking about phase 2 of the project, which is where we are now. As I said, the goal of this phase is to develop a high-level landscape restoration strategy. This strategy document will guide future project planning. It will take into account questions, it'll look at the effectiveness of different potential management approaches. It'll also do some risk analysis, look at costs and benefits, and feasibility and those kinds of factors towards getting us to a strategy that we all agree we want to pursue on the landscape. As part of developing the landscape restoration strategy, we have a pretty extensive group of scientists that we're working with on modeling the outcomes of potential management strategies that we could take on the landscape. We also are working with economists from UC Berkeley and elsewhere to analyze costs and benefits of potential strategies. We're using an ecosystem management decision support tool. I won't get into what that is, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. We'll also be looking at some existing science in addition to the modeling. And then at the center of developing the landscape restoration strategy is a stakeholder process. So ultimately, we'll have a lot of information that we can use from our modeling and scientific analysis. And we'll use a process of collaboration and negotiation with stakeholders to figure out what kinds of trade-offs will go into the strategy. I'll say more about that in just a second. So this is my last slide, and it's a bit much, so bear with me. I want to say just a couple more things about the process that we're using to develop the landscape restoration strategy that we're hoping will get us toward a resilient landscape. So in this phase, we're actually modeling, as I said, the projected outcomes of different management approaches that we could take on the landscape. So in that upper right-hand blue box, it shows the different modeling elements we're looking at, using 7 different models that address vegetation, fire, wildlife, air quality, and water quality and quantity. So for example, through the modeling, we're asking, what would happen if we if we continued our current approach to forest management on the West Shore, which is very much a community protection focus in the wildland-urban interface. Alternatively, what would happen if we expanded forest management beyond the WUI and did more extensive vegetation treatments in areas that are not really accessible right now because there aren't roads there? What would happen if we focused our efforts on restoring the natural fire regime to the landscape? So the modeling is going to help tell us how those approaches compare in terms of achieving landscape resilience. And we're looking at about a 100-year time frame, but we'll have modeling results at time steps, probably 10-year time steps that we can look at. I should say that we're evaluating these questions under a couple of different future climate scenarios. And so that'll help us further think about how our strategy helps us adapt to climate change. So lastly, I want to point out that developing the landscape restoration strategy will ultimately come down to a deliberation and negotiation process among our various stakeholders. And we'll ask some hard questions about the approaches that are most likely to be effective and about the trade-offs that they entail. So one of our key questions, for example, is going to be, what kind of air quality impacts would people be willing to accept in order to restore a natural fire regime? If we think that a natural fire regime is an important component of landscape resilience, then that comes with air quality impacts, and how do we work that out? So through that negotiation, we'll develop our landscape restoration strategy, and then that will help us launch into phase 3 of our project, hopefully at the end of this year, when we'll actually get into project planning and documentation. So thanks very much. I'm happy to answer questions. I think those might be reserved towards the end of the webinar, but I'm also available by phone or email if you want to get in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that great presentation. And I want to point out to folks that they're welcome to type in questions as they happen. We won't get to them till the end, but if you have a hot burning question you don't want to forget, feel free to type it in and we'll try to get to it. So for our next presenter, we have Elliot Vanderkolk from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and he will be presenting on his Community and Watershed Resilience Program. So Elliot, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I will unmute you. Oh, looks like you're, yep, perfect. Okay.
All right, good morning, everyone. Is that up or?
Yes, it's
there we go.
Yeah, perfect. We can hear you and we can see you.
All right, thank you so much to everyone for having me here, and I'm excited to talk to you about our Community and Watershed Resilience Program. So I'm just going to give a quick outline of what I'm going to cover here. A little bit of background on the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. I know that Nikki mentioned us earlier, and maybe some of you aren't familiar with who we are or what we do, so I'll go into that a little bit. And then I'll dive into our Community and Watershed Resilience Program overview. And following that, I'll dive in a little deeper into one of our 3 activities that we're doing in the Forest and Watershed Health Program. And then talk a little bit about how climate mitigation and adaptation fit into these and some of the initial lessons we've learned throughout the process here. So really quickly, Sierra Nevada Conservancy is a state agency. We're pretty young, created just in 2004. We have a very large range running from Kern County in the south all the way to Modoc County. And 60% of the developed water in California comes from our watersheds. So what happens in our forested watersheds really affects everybody within this state. And our mission is down here. I'll let you read that if you'd like. But I just want to let you know that generally what we do is we work with partners throughout the region on forest and watershed health projects, as well as recreation, tourism, and other diverse projects in the region. And mostly we do that as a grant maker, issuing grants from general obligation bonds such as Prop 84 and Prop 1. And the project that I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit different, just in that instead of us being the grant maker, we are the grantee. And that's funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And this is from the National Disaster Resilience Competition, which was a national program that was launched in 2015 to encourage communities, state and local governments to think about long-term climate resilience and resilience within their recovery plans from natural disasters. And in order to apply, state or local governments had to have a presidentially declared disaster, of which in California, the Rim Fire of 2013 was one of them. And folks at the state decided this would be a good opportunity to try to innovate and think about issues related to rural resilience, thinking about drought and wildfire under a changing climate, and to think about how we can create a new model of how we respond and recover to these from these disasters in the future. So it's pretty new for a lot of folks. This is just a quick table with the different winners or awardees from the National Disaster Resilience Competition. You'll notice we're the only one on the West Coast. We're also the only one dealing with a wildfire. And we're really trying to think about wildfire now as a disaster that's on par with hurricanes and floods and other types of natural disasters. And they need to be funded or thought about in similar ways when we rebuild from them and we recover from them. So with that funding, we've created the Community and Watershed Resilience Program, which is multi-state and federal and local partners. So the State Department of Housing and Community Development is our fiscal sponsor. They are the HUD affiliate, so they know everything that has to do with community development block grants and HUD funding and sort of the regulatory environment. And then the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and Cal EPA provide oversight and executive level leadership and advising on the project. And this bottom row here are the sub-grantees that are really implementing a lot of the projects. So the Sierra Nevada Conservancy acts as the project manager on 2/3 of the project, working closely with the Forest Service because most of the activities we're doing are on Forest Service land and they are the lead, but we coordinate some things and also maintain public involvement and collaboration within the project and make sure things move forward. CAL FIRE is also really involved in the field break portion of that, and I'll get into some of the details of our project activities in a minute. And Tuolumne County runs one pillar, which is the continuation of a, I wonder if there's this. Okay, sorry, that's a different chat. So they manage the community resilience pillar. So, okay, so what are we doing in the Community Watershed Resilience Program? So we call these our 3 pillars of the program. The first one is the Forest and Watershed Health Program, which I'm going to get into a little bit more, but it has to do with encouraging forest resilience post-fire. So we're treating some of the fuels within the rim fire or burn area by either piling and burning or removing some of that biomass to a bioenergy facility where possible, and following up with that with reforestation in the area. We're also investing in strategic fuel breaks throughout the region to think about the next fire, as well as addressing some of the noxious weeds that have popped in since the fire. And the fire also burned a lot of rangeland and infrastructure, so fencing, troughs, et cetera, that haven't allowed us to manage our livestock as well as we would like to. So the other pillars of the project are the Biomass Wood Products Campus. So SNC is the lead on this pillar, and we're trying to think about the future of this landscape and thinking about ongoing forest restoration treatments that we know we need to do, and trying to come up with a place for that material to go, either as waste management or small or as potential marketable wood products. So small diameter timber or other things that we know can help either pay their way out of the woods or provide a good opportunity to piling and burning on the landscape. And the final pillar that I don't deal with as much is the Community Resilience Center. And so this is it's going to be a place where community members can go in as a temporary evacuation shelter, or they can, there's also going to be ongoing year-round events and services offered there to bring more community cohesion and also provide more services to the community. So here's sort of a conceptual diagram of how we see these pillars working together. The total award for our grant is about $70 million, and you can see what we requested and what we awarded. We really see these together just because we know that a healthy forest, a resilient forest, is really important to the community, especially for economic development, for jobs, as well as for protection and recreation and other services that are really important. And in order to maintain that healthy forest, we really need a qualified workforce, jobs and folks that work in the industry that can do work that we know needs to be done. And so we see all these together. And this is really what we're trying to encourage folks to think about when they have a fire in their community. So to think about how these 3 pillars these types of approaches can work together to solve some of the problems that they're facing. So here's some of an overview of the area, and I'm sure most of you have heard of the rim fire before, but it burned about 257,000 acres within Tuolumne and a little bit of Mariposa County. And this is a little bit of the areas where we're going to be targeting. It's pretty broad at this stage. I have some new things we're going to be posting in the next week or two about that are more specific. So if you're interested, you can look at our website and other things like that, and we'll have some more updated areas and maps for where we're going in 2018. And the little lines around the edges are fuel breaks that we're going to be expanding and investing in. So just to dive in a little bit more on the Forest and Watershed Health Program that we're implementing here, our goals are really thinking about how to recover and build resilience to an uncertain future, one with hotter or drier climate conditions, potentially more devastating wildfire behavior. So that's really a piece of what we're trying to think ahead while also meeting current needs. We also really want to be supporting the ongoing forest collaboration that's happening in the area. The Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions Group began meeting before the Rim Fire, actually, and has been incredibly engaged during and after the Rim Fire to design and put their feedback towards how to recover from this landscape and to do a restoration plan. So we're very excited to work with them, and they are a key piece of this puzzle. They have members from timber industry and environmental organizations, the Forest Service, and other concerned members of the public. So we work very closely with them, and this is a very large fire, and they created this restoration plan, but there wasn't a lot of money from the Forest Service to implement some of the programs. So this $28 million that we have is really going a long ways in moving from vision to action from that collaborative group. We're also really trying to think about how to secure carbon stocks on the landscape, which means keeping forest as forest. And the Rim Fire had high severity fire patches up to 50,000 acres, and that really isn't the type of disturbance that this forest type is adapted to. And so we want to be able to make sure that we can keep those areas as forest. We know that those conifer species have a really hard time seeding much further than a few hundred feet. So getting in there to replant in some areas is really important to the long-term resilience and increasing the carbon storage on the landscape. And I'll get into more of our reforestation efforts in a minute. And we also just want to be thinking about, like I mentioned, creating this replicable model for recovery and resilience. There's a lot to be done on the front end to try to prevent things like the Rim Fire, but we also have to have a backup plan for when they do happen, because it's inevitable. So we have to think about, we want to be encouraging issues of rural and community and climate resilience within these restoration plans. So here's a little bit of, this is kind of text heavy, I apologize, but kind of getting into the details of what we're doing. Our first step is really to get in and remove some of the residual burn material, just because we know we've seen this pattern of repeated high severity fire on these areas. We want to go in, and before we replant any of those areas, we have to get rid of the fuels that are still there, or else we think they're just going to reburn, and that doesn't really help us get to the future that we want to see. So, like I mentioned, we're also minimizing the spread of noxious weeds in the Rim Fire burn area. So that's through targeted grazing, prescribed burning, select herbicide application, and sort of integrated pest management approach. And we're also rebuilding rangeland infrastructure and wildlife-friendly troughs, as I mentioned. And then our reforestation plan is up to 4,500 acres. So the plan that YSS and the Forest Service collaboratively developed accounts for about 29,000 acres-ish, about 25,000 of which are actively reforested on a scale of 257,000 acres. It's a lot of area that's not going to be reforested or touched, so that'll be left as it is. And the areas that we're reforesting are really, we have 4 different alternatives to kind of to try out some new ideas for reforestation on the landscape. And our final activity that we're doing is we're taking the existing fuel break network in the county and expanding it by either connecting previously unconnected fuel breaks or by widening them. So a lot of these are about 150 feet wide. And for those of you that don't know how a fuel break functions, it's not really a fuel break is kind of a misnomer. It's more of a staging area for wildfire personnel to safely stage and fight the fire. So what we do is we're finding that we need these widths to be 300 to almost 500 feet wide, and these are shaded fuel breaks, so it's not full strip cutting. It's removing a lot of the ladder fuels and maintaining an overstory so that you can keep shrub growth minimal. So anyway, we're finding it really important to widen these to provide better protection for the next fire. So how does climate and carbon fit into this piece? So as I think some of you may know, rimfire, when it burned, emitted about 12 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's, as this little, hopefully this animation showing up, that's about the same amount of carbon as the city of San Francisco in an entire year, or about like 2.5 million cars over the course of a year. So again, we're trying to think about ways that we can, one, prevent the next rimfire or type of fire like this that have huge carbon implications. And we do that by trying to keep things, keep the forest as forest. And we also want to be always thinking about what the next fire is, so that when we replant this forest, we're not setting the stage for the next rimfire to come by and remove all the work that we've done. Okay. And then we're also designing, planning for the next fire really also has to do with adapting to future climate conditions. So in our reforestation efforts, the Forest Service has this, I don't know if folks know this, but the way that they replant areas is they select seeds from seed zones that are of similar elevation, aspect, soil conditions, climate conditions. And in this case, we're anticipating a hotter and drier future, so we're bumping up the elevation about 500 feet. So we're growing trees higher than where they came from originally, to try to, thinking that those individuals will be better suited to a drier, hotter climate. So that's one of the ways we're thinking about climate as we're pursuing this. We're also, as we're planting, we're planting a mixed conifer, high species diversity with ponderosa pine, sugar pine, white fir, Doug fir, incense cedar, even some giant sequoia. And those are all, the ratios of those vary depending on the elevation and other site characteristics. But it's really important that, we're trying to also create some of the structural diversity, so those individuals, clumps, and openings that we know were common in this forest historically. So we're doing different planting patterns, including, planting only a portion of the unit, or planting in sort of random patterns, to try to create some of that structure on the front end rather than having to create it later. So knowing that fire can re-enter those stands more easily. And like I mentioned, we're widening and expanding our strategic fuel breaks to try to get to accommodate the future fires that we expect to be seeing and that we are currently seeing. And so I'll just do this really quick on some lessons learned. It's been quite a steep learning curve for all of our partners involved. We're very new to HUD and CDBG and all these things, and HUD is not used to working in forest, and so there's a lot of sharing and learning that's been going on, but that's also caused some delays. One other issue is there's a fair amount of overlapping federal and state regulations related to contracting. The regulations follow the money through federal government to the state, back to the federal government. So there's a lot of figuring those things out. And as I mentioned, we're experimenting with different planting designs, and we're finding that they're significantly more expensive, 2 to 3 times more expensive on the acre. And so we need to have a conversation later on about, which ones of these are working, and do they justify the costs up front? So these are things that we're continuing to try to learn. And it's getting much more difficult to do things 5 years post-fire. There's a lot of brush that's coming up, competing vegetation, and things like that. So if you can start sooner, that's better. So that's all I have for you today. Here you can see my contact information. Feel free to get in touch if you'd like to learn more. And we have our SNC website on here that has more information about the program. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elliot. So the next speaker we have lined up is Camille Swayze, and I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead. We have your screen up. We can see you.
Great. Can you hear me too?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Camille Swayze. I'm a program lead here at the Sierra Institute for Community Environment. We're a pretty small nonprofit based in Taylorsville, California, population 154. And we work on a lot of issues at the intersection of forest health and community health. And I encourage you to check out our website and learn more about a lot of really cool programs and projects we've got going on. But I'm here to primarily talk about our wood utilization work in Plumas County. Plumas County is pretty remote and rural. We have about 20,000 people across the county. It's pretty impoverished and it's heavily forested. We're amidst the Plumas National Forest and parts of the Lassen National Forest. Alike most other Sierra Nevada, and rural forested parts of California. Catastrophic wildfires are a reality for us, and the community impacts from these wildfires are pretty strong. We've had a number of mega fires in the last decade or so, including the Moonlight Fire, which closed schools for 2 weeks in 2007 just from all the smoke. And we had the Chips Fire in 2012, which threatened a lot of PG&E power infrastructure, and they spent a lot of money trying to depower that during that time. Even last summer, the Minerva Fire threatened Quincy for a week or two, and it wasn't a huge fire, but the air quality impacts were pretty intense. The visibility was very poor for about a week there. And this is also the Upper Feather River watershed. It's a really critical watershed as it feeds the State Water Project, which sends water down to Southern California. And at the same time, communities here are still struggling to recover from the decline of the timber industry over the last 20 years or so. We got pretty low median household income and high unemployment rates in a lot of communities in our area. The Indian Valley area, which is where we're based, used to host a dozen mills, and now we have none. So that's a dramatic loss of industry and employers in our area. So there's a lot of momentum up and down the state right now to increase wood utilization efforts, and that's really to promote forest restoration work. So if you develop an outlet for the low value material, then you can promote the work that's going to reduce the risk of fire and improve forest and watershed health. And by creating an alternative to open pile burning, you also help improve air quality in the valleys, and also ideally with less catastrophic wildfire, the air quality is just in general better. And if wood is utilized in heating applications, which I'm about to talk more about, then that's another opportunity for communities to have some economic benefit, and that it stabilizes their heating costs and reduces their reliance on fossil fuels. So with a California Energy Commission planning grant in 2013, we developed a renewable energy plan for the county focused on using forest biomass, and it was a collaborative effort. We had a lot of stakeholders involved, and the product of that was this vision for a kind of county-wide network of biomass heating systems anchored by a chip processing facility and a smaller bioenergy facility in Crescent Mills in the middle of the county. And part of that work included a really rough assessment of heating costs. So we compared what a lot of entities are currently paying for heat and what they're using for heat, and then compared what they could be paying if they converted to wood-fired boilers. And so something to recognize is that we don't have access to natural gas here, and that's a pretty common fuel used in the Sacramento Valley and also urban areas for heating. And so folks are forced to use propane and fuel oil, which are subject to volatile prices. And we've got a lot of really outdated facilities as well. So we saw this as a great opportunity to encourage folks to convert to biomass heat and be able to utilize an incredibly abundant local renewable fuel source that can also add some community benefit to our area if it's used more. This is some of the results of that really rough assessment, and there's a lot of numbers to look at here, but what we want you to look at is the savings on the right there. These are just some major public buildings, hospitals, schools, county buildings, etc., that if they diverted from fossil fuel uses and used biomass heat, they could save a lot per year just in operational costs. And the other part to look at down here in the summary box is a lot of fossil fuel gallons would be offset. So we often get a lot of concerns in our community about biomass technology, and I think that's because in the 70s, Quincy High School had a boiler put in, a biomass boiler, and it totally failed. And so people really like to remind us about that, to which we say, that was 1970. Technology's come a long way since then, and biomass technologies are way more efficient, and they're incredibly cleaner than these dirty facilities that a lot of folks think they might be. And the point is not to have a renewable, completely clean renewable energy generation facility. It's really about developing that outlet for this material that's just going to get piled and burned in the woods or burn in a catastrophic wildfire. And the emissions profile is really different and much better across the board if you're burning that material in a confined boiler versus in an open pile. So our first success, 2015, we got another CEC grant to fund construction of a biomass heating system for the county's Health and Human Services Center in Quincy. And there's also a small power generation component to help offset the electrical costs needed to run the system. It doesn't use a whole lot of material. 400 to 500 bone dry tons a year is roughly equivalent to 40 to 50 acres thinned per year of a standard mixed conifer forest land. And really to help advance our vision of using more wood products in our community, we had the boiler building constructed of cross-laminated timber, which I'll go into more in a little bit. And I, again, like to remind folks that these community scale heating system applications are not these big power generating facilities that you might see at a sawmill or elsewhere in the Central Valley. It's pretty small. It's a closed loop system. There's no net loss of water. And basically wood chips are combusted in a boiler. And in this particular application, they then are generated, they generate power in this organic Rankine cycle power generator, and that's where we have our power revenue and savings. And then the residual heat from that go to actually heat the county building. So we really, our work is focused on doing this at a community scale, and so that's using existing resources we have and having it be a community-driven project. And so we struggled to find a contractor for this effort for a while, and eventually found a fella based in the Quincy area who's been doing residential construction for a number of years, who really expressed enthusiasm for taking this on, and he could do it roughly within the budget we had. And he pretty much saved us. He pulled us out of engineering and really got us going. And all of his subcontracts are also local. So we're proud to say that all construction contracts were awarded within Plumas County's boundaries. So more on the CLT building. So for those who are not familiar with the product, cross-laminated timber is not a new building product, but it's definitely emerging in U.S. building construction projects. It consists of lumber in a cross-layered fashion, and it's proven to be a structurally sound alternative to concrete and steel, and has also demonstrated fire-resistant properties, even more so than concrete and steel in some applications, and also it's pretty seismic safe. So this is California's first full CLT building, so there's no metal in the structure or anything else other than screws. All the panels went up in 2 days. It was pretty fun to watch, and it's especially exciting to me that the first full CLT building in California was done by a completely Quincy-based local crew, and they're pretty happy about it. They're there at the bottom. So we had some delays with equipment delivery, naturally, but all the biomass equipment arrived on site in January, and the same crew that did the building has been leading this work too, and they've been working diligently to have everything installed pretty quickly. We're on the final stretch of installation work, and up next we got some pretty extensive control wiring that looks pretty complicated to me. And then we're going to start testing out the system and firing it up in late March with the ribbon cutting in early April. So we're all about replicability. We want to see this network built out, and we want to see more community scale, community-based driven projects. So we've funded a number of feasibility studies for other entities in the county, and all these studies come back to say it's a really attractive cost savings option, biomass heat is, but the capital costs are pretty high, and a lot of these entities, naturally, as they're in rural areas, are pretty cash strapped and risk averse. So we want to help them overcome a lot of barriers. Quincy, or the school district here, actually recently got the Wood Innovations Grant to fund a full engineering study for a biomass system at Quincy High School, so that's pretty exciting. But we want to be able to share our lessons learned and help folks work through challenges and we went through a lot of challenges. We had a really tight budget. Just a lot of things could have gone wrong that now we know how to avoid them. And we would like to see other entities not have as many hurdles as we've experienced, and help bring them to this point, but also continue to keep it within the community. And so the other half of our work is trying to redevelop this old mill site in Crescent Mills into a wood products campus that would use a variety of technologies to generate value-added products out of low-value wood, so small diameter trees and other woody biomass that comes out of forest restoration efforts, and something that will benefit the community and employ locally and stay locally. Something we ran into pretty early on is that old sawmill sites or any old industrial sites are contaminated, and it's less that they're not super contaminated, super fun sites, but they've got a lot of liability associated with them. And the reality is, in these rural areas, it's generally nonprofits and community groups that are trying to redevelop these sites and advance these wood utilization projects. And unfortunately, the state doesn't have any vehicles in place to reduce liability for a nonprofit doing this work in an unincorporated area. There's stuff set up to support bigger companies in cities, but none for community groups in rural areas. So that's been a challenge for us. We've kind of carved our own path. We've had a lot of site assessment work done just so we know what's out there. Again, the contamination's not that bad. It's arsenic left over from old mill operations and also maybe from the mine tailings that were used to originally develop the site. So we're in the process of writing a cleanup plan, and we're just trying to take all the appropriate steps we need to reduce our liability because we can't afford to take on that risk. So just another challenge to point out that a lot of folks working on these projects have faced. So this is the concept we're trying to advance. There's a variety of co-products at the right side there, a lot of them using residual heat from a power generation facility. And then we've got the community outcomes and the job creation in the middle there. We want this to be the prototype for community scale wood utilization projects in rural parts of California, and we want it to work. And so we've put a lot of time and money into really fine-tuning this model and looking at economics and figuring out how we can get this to work at this scale and then stay in the community and not just pick up and relocate to the Central Valley after a few years of successful operations, because that would really be detrimental to our community. And I also want to recognize that there are more of us. There are many communities up and down California working on really similar projects, and they're all at various stages of implementation. So we lead another program called the Rural Community Development Initiative, and it's a peer learning network where we bring all of these communities together and we all identify challenges we faced and learn from each other's lessons, and we help bring in resources to build capacity of everyone so they can have some success and create jobs and address the forest health and tree mortality issues that they're all facing. So the bottom line I'm really trying to get across here is that in order to really address fire risk and tree mortality, we got to have processing infrastructure and manufacturing capacity in communities throughout the Sierra and the rest of forested California. And if it's done at a community scale, then there's a great opportunity to couple forest health treatments with rural economic development and have local economies rebuilt on sustainable forest management. So that's pretty much the quick 15-minute version of what we're working on. Thanks for listening, and please contact me if you want to talk about anything further. Come visit us in Taylorsville. If you haven't been, it's a pretty cool place. Hoping to get some snow with this next storm pretty soon. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Camille. That was a great presentation from all three of our members. Our next presenter is from Sierra Business Council. It's Steve Frisch, our president. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? someone could just tap into the chat box to let me know that you can see my screen. Awesome, great, thank you so much. All right, Steve, it's yours.
Great, well, thanks a lot, Elliot, Sarah, and Camille. Great presentations. For those of you that don't know Sierra Business Council, we're a regional sustainable development organization covering the Sierra Nevada. Our boundaries of operation are roughly coterminous with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy boundaries that Elliot explained earlier. We're also the Small Business Development Center for Northeastern California, so that's the region from El Dorado County north to the Oregon border. And the project I'm going to talk about today, the Loyalton Biomass Cogeneration and Ecotech Campus, has been a joint product of Sierra Business Council and our SBDC in partnership with American Renewable Power, who recently acquired the Loyalton site and has been working on the restoration of the existing biomass cogen facility. So we all know that in the long run, our objective is fire resilient forests in the Sierra Nevada. I think we know what the stakes are when we start looking at historic tree mortality driven by both drought and climate change, and the catastrophic wildfires that Elliot referenced, similar to the Rim Fire or the Moonlight Fire. And what that means in our region in the long run. Our project is really focused on this idea of beginning to create wood products campuses so that we can not only generate renewable energy, but rebuild the infrastructure for wood products in California so we can create a wider variety of products that actually will replace kind of carbon-based manufacturing, or rather fossil fuel-based manufacturing processes in other areas. We all know that in California, the profile of this issue has been increased by wildfires that are now beginning to intrude into heavily urbanized areas. I was stunned going through Sonoma County right after the fires at the damage, not just to residential neighborhoods, but to large-scale commercial properties across the state. And it really has reinvigorated the focus in California on this issue of finding a way to deal with these crises. And then, of course, hopefully we are getting a massive storm this week, but this pattern of atmospheric river on top of wildfire is really the beginning of kind of the impact of climate change in the region that we think we're going to struggle with, and vegetation management is clearly a major strategy for addressing those issues, and we know what the consequences are if we don't really begin to address this issue. So with that in mind, we began working with American Renewable Power on the purchase of the Loyalton Biomass facility about 1.5 years ago. It's a 20 megawatt gross generation capacity facility right on the edge of Loyalton in unincorporated Sierra County. It's a 212 acre parcel. The sawmill had been there for more than 100 years. The biomass facility had been there for about 60 years, and then was refurbished in 1989, but then shut down afterwards, and has been closed since 2007. So about 1.5 years ago, we began working with ARP on refurbishing that site. It has now been fully refurbished and certified by the California Energy Commission for 20 megawatts of gross output. It has all of its appropriate interconnections, including to the Cal ISO facility, or the Cal ISO system. It has all of its permitting in place, including air quality permits, EPA permits, and everything else. And then on the adjacent site, the 212 acre site, there is also an industrially zoned area that has plumbed hot water, steam, and district heating at this point. So there's an opportunity here to begin looking at this issue of capturing waste heat and diverting it to kind of a wood products kind of application. So far, the plan has been a $13 million investment. Of that $13 million, only $600,000 has come from the California Competes tax credit program. So the vast majority of the investment to date has been private. Although just recently we've been doing some fundraising around developing wood products. And thanks to a grant from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy of roughly $100,000 and a private funder of roughly $60,000, we're beginning to market the site as a wood products campus to outside investors. 100% of the fuel to drive the biomass facility is essentially coming within a 65-mile radius of the facility. 85% of the fuel is scheduled to come from forest residuals in the surrounding Plumas and Sierra and Toyabe National Forests. The facility will use about 300,000 green tons or about 180,000 bone dry tons a year for electricity generation. And the amount of woody renewables usable for the value-added applications we really have not fully modeled out at this point. So the facility, unlike Camille's example, which we strongly support, of community scale and thermal biomass applications, this is a pretty traditional power plant, as you saw from the previous slide, of boilers and district heating. The fuel sources are, as I said, predominantly forest thinning, so we're trying to divert open burning in the region. Some of the fuel supply, well, actually, this slide is in here. None of the fuel supply at this point is coming from agricultural waste. But about 13% of the fuel supply is coming from urban waste. And the number one urban waste diversion so far is coming from actually Tesla in Reno. So we're recycling the pallets that Tesla uses to ship their battery cores from China to the United States. So that's been an interesting process. What we're really hoping to do is pull the vast majority of the fuel from the local forest through forest thinning contracting and provide a market for those forest thinnings for both fire safe councils, conservation organizations, and U.S. Forest Service contractors within the region. We all know what's been happening to biomass facilities across the state. This is the list of producing facilities in 2000 with a little under 7 million fuel tons in use. This is what is projected at the current rate for 2020. So we have so far basically cut in half the number of tons of material that we're treating due to losing infrastructure. So really, this project is designed to develop a wood products campus where we capture the heat from the facility and we create enough marketable products that we can expand infrastructure for processing materials. This is, of course, driven by a number of issues, including tree mortality across the state, the CPUC extending contracts for biomass plants that can use forest fuels, and then really looking at focusing on high hazard zones in the Sierra Nevada. So the thing that makes this project work is that we're not looking at electricity as the primary product. So although we have put in place a 5-year power purchase agreement with the Southern California Public Power Authority at $80 per megawatt hour, which is a little above what they would be paying for solar or wind, what we're really looking at is the value-added products and low-carbon alternatives that can be developed on that adjacent industrial area. So we're looking at not just electricity and heat, but biofuels, pellets, compost, soil amendments, polymers, biochemicals. The great the big goal in the long run would be locally sourced cross-laminated timber, and then other mass timber products. And that really translates to jobs in research, technology, manufacturing, forest restoration. the things you see listed here. As Camille pointed out, this area of Northeastern California is pretty economically distressed. We have been doing some research on the economic benefits using the in-plan econometric model to take a look at job creation. Already, more than 30 jobs have been created at the facility. This is actually up to 45 now in the last 2 months, because they've added about 15 jobs in the last 2 months. About 25 to 30 of those jobs are in the logistical network that is delivering fuel. And we've done the in-plan modeling on the Ecotech campus. If it were to build out at 50% of its build-out capacity, it would create 125 jobs from uses on the Ecotech campus. Total economic activity generated from the facility on an annual basis, just under $30 million a year in economic activity, which would generate about $2.6 million a year in annual local and state tax revenue. So a couple of comments on where we are on filling out the Ecotech campus. We are working now on going out and recruiting tenants for that Ecotech campus. We have space for about 25 tenants on the existing zoned industrial area that has services plumbed to it already. And we have 6 tenants that we've signed contracts with: Pacific Biochar, Far West Forest Products. These are basically small manufacturers of biochar and small custom milled wood materials. We also have a contract with a company called Green Space, which is a 100% renewable energy-based tech data center for people who are making the choice to only store their data through renewably sourced power. We have a unnamed biofuel manufacturer who doesn't want to release their identity yet, but they've signed a contract for a portion of the site. And then we have a contract with a company called Micro Michi Green, which is a soil amendment company. So we're going to be out looking for opportunities to bring new tenants in over the next year and a half. So kind of a variety of different models that we've seen here from Sarah and Elliot and Camille and me. Our hope in the long run is that by getting local community-based infrastructure in place to begin to create markets for forest residuals, that this will work as a system, so that the land management that Sarah's talking about and that Elliot are talking about can feed into the types of projects that Camille and I are working on in order to rebuild California's infrastructure for a value-added wood products industry, which will replace kind of fossil fuel manufacturing and products in the process. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve, and to all of our presenters for taking the time to join us today. So now it is time for our Q&A. So if you hadn't had a chance to type in a question, feel free to do that now. I just want to make sure that all of our presenters are unmuted. So let me just go ahead and check that. And as you guys type your questions in, we will address them. Okay, awesome. So we have a few different questions lined up from earlier on. One question was, have incentive-based environmental markets been considered in the long-term restoration plan? And I'm not sure if this was referring to a specific presentation, but whoever wants to address this here. Then the second part of the question is the example for the use of compensatory mitigation credits to recruit certain stakeholders, such as city or county governments in targeted restoration. Just to repeat that, have incentive-based environmental markets been considered in long-term restoration plans? Do any of our speakers want to take that one on?
And I know this is Elliot from SNC. I know some folks have looked at potential carbon offset project development for avoided wildfire emissions and for biomass utilization and things like that. I think then there's been some sticking points because there's a lot of high level probability and other things that go into that. So it's something that has been talked about a lot, but it's hard to get a lot of traction on at this stage. I don't know if other folks have other experience with it, but that's been my experience so far.
So, any other additions from our speakers?
Well, this is Steve. I would just say I agree with Elliot. This has been hard to get going because the complexity of layering essentially forest restoration and management on carbon projects that can actually qualify for and sell credits, and then other private market incentives like the forest resilience bonds that groups like Blue Forest Conservation are working on. It's been a very complex process, and proving the benefits has been difficult. So I think we're getting closer to that as California is focusing through its forest carbon plan on getting good metrics on what the savings are, but it's taking a painfully long time.
Okay. So our next question is related to addressing climate change impacts. To what degree does thinning a forest avoid emissions associated with a catastrophic wildfire? And is this being measured? So maybe Elliot or Sarah, if you want to address that one, or if the other speakers have something to.
This is Elliot. Really quickly, I put a response in the chat box already, but we're not doing any thinning. We're not funding any thinning through our NDRC project, but this is something that our agency is working on and thinking about a lot. I want to point folks to Matt Hurto and some of the research he's done. And the way this can work is, if you think about when you thin a forest, you can basically you could transfer by releasing or reducing competition between trees. You're basically transferring carbon from smaller diameter trees to other trees that grow to larger diameter trees. And we're seeing that over 10 to 15 years, some of the carbon can be regrown, even though it's been removed. It can be regrown and attributed to larger trees that are more resistant to fire. And we've also changed the fuel behavior by modifying the composition of the fuels. So that's where the carbon benefit is going to come in, is one by moving it between pools, but then also creating a more resilient state in the forest to have, when fire comes through, it'll be lower intensity. So it's pretty interesting to kind of think about it transferring and releasing trees that are competing with each other to grow and take on more carbon in larger pools.
Anything to add, Sarah?
No, I think that it sounds like Elliot's thinking about this issue a lot more than we are. We are modeling carbon impacts of the different potential management strategies we could put on the landscape. But that's about all I can tell you right now. We're modeling it. It's one of the things that we're going to look at in developing our landscape restoration strategy, is how well different strategies would address carbon. But it's one of many things that we're looking at.
Okay, awesome. So our next, we had a couple questions about cross-laminated timber. So we're wondering, does it meet snow load and seismic standards in the Truckee Tahoe area or the Greater Sierra? And are there any local producers already existing?
So Camille, why don't I start on that, and then you can jump in, since you are proudly the developer of the first full CLT building in California. I'm so happy about that. We've been talking to CLT manufacturers. There are actually only 2 CLT manufacturers in the US right now. We've been talking to a company called DR Johnson in Oregon, who is the closest CLT manufacturer, about modular affordable housing and meeting snow load in high mountain environments. So the town of Mammoth Lakes is looking at using potentially CLT for some modular affordable housing. And so it'll be our first test of kind of high elevation snow load. But that second issue brought up of not having a kind of local or California-based CLT manufacturer is a really big one and a really interesting one. I think it's everyone's dream that is the product that will begin to replace steel and concrete, at least in, although CLT is being used in some higher rise buildings now. There's a 20-story building going up in downtown Portland that's CLT framed. that this could be a major kind of way to decarbonize our building stock or to reduce the carbon intensity of our building stock in California. The expense of starting up these facilities is actually quite high. So the D.R. Johnson facility was about a $60 million capital investment. So until we can really align building codes and the acceptance of the material with manufacturing, it's going to be a tough haul. We have some work to do in order to get all of the codes and standards in place in order to make it really attractive for a California CLT manufacturer at those prices. So, Camille, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So I'm no engineer, but I think so. The architects that worked on our building also helped with. I think there's a school in Truckee that used CLT panels, at least in the wall. It's not a full CLT building, but it's got some CLT. And I don't think they ran into coding issues from a snow load standpoint. So I don't know the answer to that totally, but I would imagine it's not a huge issue just because this material is so strong. And we don't leave the wood exposed on the outside. And the way that was explained to me is you never want to leave a building structure fully exposed to the elements. So ours has been cladded with like a metal cladding just to weatherproof it and prevent water from getting in. But fortunately, the inside, we get to expose that, so we can still see the wood there.
So there is an opportunity in California when we update the Title 24 Energy Efficiency Building Code, which it's done every 3 years. We're adopting one right now, so it'll be in place for the next 3 years. But they start the process of the new one within a year of the old one being adopted. So about a year from now, California will start an update of its next Title 24 code. And if we could build into that Title 24 code a requirement to calculate the carbon intensity of building materials, it would be a huge driver of creating California-based CLT manufacturing, because you would be able to give builders essentially credit for reducing the carbon intensity of their materials, which would be a big step forward.
So our next question is, are biomass facilities sustainable from a resource availability standpoint? And Steve and Camille, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I can quickly get on that because I think it supports what Steve's talking about too. When we first got into this work, we had a supply feasibility study funded for the whole Upper Feather River watershed. And that turned out to be, we're glad we did that because we actually, it turns out we used the results from that a lot to address this question. Believe it or not, even folks living in this area are concerned, is there going to be enough supply? That supply assessment showed the lower end of what's available per year to be like 135 bone dry tons at the very minimum. The reality that's probably more like 135,000. The reality it's more like 250,000 per year. And for comparison, a 3 megawatt facility that we're proposing in Crescent Mills, that would use 25,000 bone dry tons per year. And what we just put in Quincy uses 400. So there's a lot out there. I think the challenge is the economics of getting it out of the woods and some contracting issues. But in terms of supply availability, that is not a problem. Hopefully I answered that fully.
So we did a similar analysis in the 40-mile radius surrounding the Loyalton facility, which overlaps a bit of Camille's geography, and found with basically forest thinning driven by Forest Service contracts, there was roughly 600,000 bone dry tons a year available, and the facility would use 180. So the supply might be less of a problem than we think it is. It's the economics of getting the material from the woods to the facility.
All right, and it is now 11:30. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So thank you to all of our presenters for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, I'll reach out to you after the webinar today or tomorrow to see if we can address that. But thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar and have a great rest of your week.